Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime History. Tonight we are going somewhere enormous, not just in geography but in ambition. At its height, the Spanish Empire was the largest empire the world had ever seen. It stretched across 2 continents, wrapped itself around the Pacific Ocean, and reached quietly toward the shores of Asia. It raised cathedrals in the jungles of Mexico. It carved silver out of the buried heart of the Andes Mountains. It sent trading ships across waters no European had ever charted before. This is a story about gold, yes, but it is also a story about hunger, about miscalculation, about brilliance used for terrible purposes, and about a particular kind of ruthlessness that seems to appear again and again whenever one civilization collides headlong into another. If this is your first time here, welcome. If you've been here before, I'm glad you came back. And wherever you're listening from tonight, whether it's late in London, quiet in California, or long past midnight somewhere in Southeast Asia, leave your location and your local time in the comments below. It helps other sleepless travelers find their way here too. Now get comfortable, settle in, let the day go, because we are about to drift backward to a quiet peninsula at the edge of the known world, where a secret marriage between 2 teenagers would set in motion one of the most consequential empires in human history. Before there was a Spanish Empire, there was not even a Spain. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because nothing that follows makes sense without it. The Iberian Peninsula, that broad thumb of land reaching into the Atlantic at Europe's southwestern corner, had never been one place. In the early 800s, it was a patchwork of rival worlds. In the north, small Christian kingdoms clung to the mountains: Castile, Aragon, Leon, Navarre. In the south, Muslim rulers who had crossed from North Africa in the year 711 held the richest, most cultured cities on the peninsula. Córdoba, under Moorish rule, had once been among the largest cities in all of Europe, a place of libraries, philosophers, and running water, at a time when most of the continent was still trying to keep a roof over its head. What followed over the centuries was something historians call the Reconquista, the Reconquest. It was not one clean campaign. It was a tide, advancing, retreating, interrupted by treaties, by uneasy alliances, and, often enough, by Christian kingdoms fighting each other more enthusiastically than they ever fought the Moors. The Moorish world was fractured too, broken into smaller kingdoms called taifas, which quarreled among themselves and sometimes hired Christian mercenaries to do their fighting for them. One of those mercenaries, a Castilian nobleman named Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, became so feared and so respected on both sides of the war that history still remembers him by the name his enemies gave him, El Cid. By the 1400s, the Reconquista had been grinding forward for 700 years. All that remained of Moorish Spain was the Kingdom of Granada, tucked into the southeastern corner of the peninsula, surrounded on 3 sides by Christian land, surviving on tribute, diplomacy, and the simple fact that no one had yet gathered enough force to finish it. That changed in 1469. In October of that year, a 17-year-old princess named Isabella of Castile married an 18-year-old prince named Ferdinand of Aragon. It was not a love match arranged at leisure. It was something closer to a conspiracy. Isabella's half-brother, King Henry IV of Castile, had never authorized the match and would never have allowed it. Ferdinand had to disguise himself as a servant just to cross into Castile undetected. They had never even met before the ceremony. What they built together, though, was not improvised at all. Isabella became Queen of Castile in 1474, after a disputed succession that nearly collapsed into civil war. Ferdinand became King of Aragon 5 years later. The 2 crowns never formally merged. Castile and Aragon kept their own laws, their own governments, their own identities, but they were now ruled by the same two people. And those two people knew exactly what they wanted. Unity. A very specific kind of unity. Catholic unity. In 1478, Isabella and Ferdinand established the Spanish Inquisition, a religious tribunal backed by royal power, originally aimed at Jewish and Muslim converts suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths. It became one of the most feared institutions in Europe. Not because of the number of executions, popular memory has inflated those figures considerably, but because it built a culture of surveillance, suspicion, and accusation that reached into every household. Then, in January of 1492, after 10 years of siege, the Kingdom of Granada finally fell. The last Moorish Sultan, Muhammad XII, known to the Spanish as Boabdil, surrendered the keys to the Alhambra Palace and rode out of the city forever. The Reconquista was over. For the first time in nearly 800 years, the entire peninsula belonged to a single Christian crown. But 1492 was not finished with its surprises. Just 3 months after Granada fell, in that same extraordinary year, Isabella signed an agreement with a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus to fund a voyage west, across an ocean no one had crossed. The two events are connected more deeply than the calendar suggests. 8 centuries of holy war had built a machine, soldiers, military orders, a belief that conquest was both duty and destiny, and that machine did not simply switch off now that the peninsula was whole. Turned outward, and somewhere to the southwest, 3 small ships were about to begin moving across open water, toward something no one in Europe had ever mapped. Here is something the popular story leaves out. Columbus had already been rejected, more than once. The image that survived, the lone visionary, the flat earth skeptics, the triumphant queen, hides a messier, stranger truth. The voyage of 1492 was not a sudden flash of genius, finally recognized. It was the end of a long, grinding sales pitch, made by a man who was, by most accounts, exhausting to deal with. He had already been turned down by Portugal, the one kingdom that should have said yes. Portugal, in the 1480s, led the world in ocean exploration. Its navigators had spent decades working their way down the African coast. By 1488, Bartholomew Dias had rounded the southern tip of Africa. Portugal could see, almost within reach, a sea route east to Asia. Columbus offered them something different, a route west. His math rested on old geography, a selective reading of Marco Polo, and the letters of a cartographer named Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli, who believed the western route was shorter than anyone assumed. The math was wrong. Badly wrong. Columbus believed the distance from the Canary Islands to Japan was roughly 2,400 miles. It is closer to 12,000. If the Americas had not happened to be sitting in the way, his entire expedition would have vanished somewhere in the middle of the empty Pacific, out of food, out of water, out of time. Portugal's own geographers worked this out immediately and said no. So Columbus turned to Spain. He arrived at the Spanish court in 1486, and Isabella, intrigued but cautious, convened a commission of scholars to study his plan. Took them 4 years. Their conclusion was the same as Portugal's. The numbers didn't work. And yet, the door never quite closed. Columbus stayed in Spain. He waited. He made himself visible at court again and again, and found himself a patron in a royal treasury official named Luis de Santangel, a man with a gift for making a small risk sound like a very large opportunity. When the commission's rejection seemed to end the matter for good, Santangel went to Isabella directly and made the case one more time. The cost, he argued, was almost nothing. The potential reward was almost everything. He wasn't wrong about the cost. The whole expedition, partly funded by the crown, partly by a town that owed the crown a debt it repaid in ships, partly by private investors, cost very little, especially for a kingdom that had just finished paying for a 10-year war. What Spain hoped to gain was a route to Asia's spice markets, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, goods that were, at the time, worth more than luxury. They were medicine. They were preservation. They were survival. And the old overland routes had grown dangerous and expensive since the Ottoman Empire tightened its grip on the Middle East. In April of 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand signed the capitulations of Santa Fe. The terms Columbus negotiated were staggering: the hereditary title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, the governorship of any lands he found, and 10% of all revenue from them, forever. It was the kind of contract only a very stubborn man, kept waiting a very long time, could have extracted. 3 ships assembled at the port of Palos. The Santa Maria, a heavy cargo ship, Columbus's flagship. The Nina and the Pinta, smaller, faster, built for the Atlantic. 90 men in total. Not desperate convicts, as legend sometimes claims, experienced sailors from the port towns of Andalusia, men who knew the ocean well enough that sailing further into it was frightening, but not unthinkable. On August the 3rd, 1492, the fleet sailed south toward the Canary Islands, and then turned west. Into nothing. 33 days of open water followed. The trade winds carried them steadily. Compasses behaved strangely near the Sargasso Sea. Anxious sailors, trained to navigate by coastlines, grew uneasy as the days stretched on with no land in sight. Columbus is said to have kept 2 separate logs, one showing the true distance covered, and a shorter, gentler one he shared with the crew, to keep them calm. Then, in the early hours of October the 12th, 1492, a lookout aboard the Pinta, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana, saw something on the horizon. Land. Columbus came ashore on an island in the Bahamas, which one historians still argue over, though San Salvador is the most widely accepted guess. He named it San Salvador, claimed it for the crown of Castile, and wrote in his journal that the people he met there seemed gentle, and would, he noted, make good servants. He believed, until the day he died, that he had reached Asia. He hadn't. Back in Europe, the news spread fast, and it made Portugal deeply uneasy. In 1494, Spain and Portugal sat down and drew an invisible line straight through the Atlantic Ocean. Everything east belonged to Portugal. Everything west belonged to Spain. Neither country had actually mapped what they were dividing. The gamble had paid off, though not in the way anyone expected. What Spain had bought, for the price of 3 ships and 1 difficult navigator, was a claim on 2 entire continents that Europe did not yet know existed. The machine of empire was about to start moving. The people waiting on that beach had no idea what had just arrived. The Taino, the indigenous people Columbus encountered across his first months in the Caribbean, were not the simple, primitive figures they'd later be described as. They lived in organized villages ruled by chiefs called caciques. They farmed cassava, sweet potato, and maize. They fished the coastal waters with real skill and traded across a network that stretched through the island chains of the Caribbean. Their world was not waiting to be discovered. It was simply there, functioning on its own terms, exactly as it had for centuries. Columbus's journal from those first days reads like delighted bewilderment. He noted their skin, their lack of iron weapons, their openness. He noted, carefully, that they wore small ornaments of gold. He asked through gestures where it came from. They pointed, vaguely, toward the interior of the larger islands. He gave them red caps and glass beads. He took several of them aboard his ships, whether they agreed to go or not. He sailed on, searching for the mainland of Asia he was sure lay just beyond the horizon. He touched the coast of Cuba and, briefly, believed it was Japan. He reached a larger island he named La Española, later Hispaniola, and found more gold in local use there. Then, on Christmas night, 1492, the Santa Maria ran aground on a reef off the northern coast of Hispaniola and could not be saved. What could have ended the voyage became, instead, an improvisation. Columbus used the wrecked ship's timber to build a small fortified settlement, which he named La Navidad, the Nativity, for the day the ship was lost. He left 39 men behind, with orders to gather gold and keep peace with the local chief, Guacanagari, who had, in fact, sent his own people to help save the ship's cargo. Columbus sailed home in January of 1493, carrying a modest amount of gold, unfamiliar plants, and several Taino people who had never agreed to make the journey. His return was pure theater. He'd written a letter describing everything he'd found and had it printed and circulating across Europe before he'd even reached the Spanish court. When he finally stood before Isabella and Ferdinand in Barcelona, he brought gold, parrots, strange plants, and the Taino captives with him, enough spectacle to make the meeting feel like the beginning of something enormous. The second voyage left that same year with nothing tentative about it. 17 ships, roughly 1,200 men. Not just sailors, but farmers, priests, craftsmen, soldiers. This was not an exploration anymore. It was the skeleton of a colony. When Columbus returned to the site of La Navidad, he found it burned to the ground. All 39 men dead. What had happened, pieced together later from Taino accounts, was simple enough. The men left behind had not kept the peace. They had demanded gold. They had taken women. They had spread out through the countryside, searching for more of both, and the local population had eventually answered with violence of their own. Columbus built a new settlement further along the coast, La Isabella, the first permanent European town in the Americas. It was, by most accounts, a miserable place. Poor soil, disease, men who had crossed an ocean expecting easy gold, put instead to work clearing land and raising walls. And the search for gold only intensified. Columbus imposed a tribute system across Hispaniola. Every adult required to deliver a fixed amount of gold every 3 months. Those who failed had their hands cut off. This was not an accident of cruelty. It was policy. Historians still argue over exactly how many Taino people lived on Hispaniola when Columbus arrived. The estimates range from several 100,000 into the millions. What no one argues over is what happened next. Within 50 years, the Taino of Hispaniola had all but vanished. Disease did most of the killing. Smallpox, measles, typhus, illnesses their bodies had never encountered and had no defense against. Violence and forced labor did the rest. It was one of the fastest demographic collapses ever recorded, and it was only the first. The same pattern would repeat, with only small variations, across almost every region Spain touched in the centuries that followed. Columbus made 4 voyages in total. On his third, in 1498, he reached the mainland of South America for the first time, the coast of what is now Venezuela, and recorded that the sheer volume of fresh water pouring from the Orinoco River could only be coming from something the size of a continent. He never fully let go of the idea that Asia was somewhere nearby. He died in 1506 in Valladolid, Spain, stripped of his governorship years earlier, still insisting the crown owed him more than it had paid. The name given to the continents he'd found was not his own. It came from another Italian navigator, Amerigo Vespucci, who had sailed the South American coast and argued, correctly, that this was not Asia at all, but an entirely new landmass. A German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller printed a map in 1507 and labeled that new landmass America in Vespucci's honor. The name stuck, and somewhere behind it, the Caribbean was now Spanish territory. The Taino were dying, and the men who had crossed the ocean looking for gold were already looking further west and south, toward mainland shores their maps still showed as nothing but blank edges. The word conquistador carries a certain weight. Armored figures, cutting through jungle and mountain with unstoppable purpose. The truth is far more human and far stranger. Most conquistadors were not wealthy men. This single fact explains almost everything else about them. Spain had a category for men like this: hidalgo, a minor nobleman, someone with a name but not necessarily land or money to go with it. After 8 centuries of war and a sudden, uneasy peace, Spain had an enormous surplus of exactly this kind of man. Trained for violence, hungry for status, and with almost nowhere left to use either. The dry, hard region of Extremadura in western Castile produced an extraordinary share of the men who would go on to shape the conquest of the Americas. Hernán Cortés came from Medellín, Francisco Pizarro from Trujillo, Hernando de Soto, Vasco Núñez de Balboa, Pedro de Valdivia. The names go on and on. The crown rarely funded these expeditions directly. Instead, a would-be conquistador signed a contract with the crown called a capitulation, outlining what he intended to do, what share of any wealth found would go to the royal treasury, always 20%, the quinto real, the royal fifth, and what titles he'd receive in return. He had to raise his own money, his own men, his own ships. Succeed, and the crown grew richer. Fail, and the loss was entirely his own. This produced a very particular kind of man. Someone willing to bet his entire future on a single roll of the dice. It also produced a culture of vicious internal rivalry. Conquistadors turned on each other as readily as they turned on the people whose land they invaded. Partnerships dissolved into murder the moment gold actually appeared. There was even a legal ritual meant to justify all of it. In 1513, Spanish jurists drafted a document called the Requerimiento, the requirement. Spanish law demanded it be read aloud to indigenous peoples before any military action could begin against them. It explained the authority of the Pope and the Pope's supposed gift of these lands to Spain, and then offered the listener a choice: accept peacefully or be conquered and enslaved, entirely through their own fault for refusing. It was sometimes read from the decks of ships, far offshore. Sometimes read to empty jungle. Sometimes read at night to a sleeping village, moments before a dawn attack. A priest named Bartolomé de las Casas, who had once been a colonist himself before turning fiercely against the system, called the Requerimiento a piece of legal theater, designed to make a mockery of the very principles it claimed to defend. The conquistadors who used it agreed completely. That was exactly why they liked it. One of them, Vasco Núñez de Balboa, showed just what this machine could produce when everything went right. He'd arrived in Hispaniola in 1500 as a failed farmer, buried in debt, and had actually stowed away on a ship bound for Panama just to escape his creditors. Resourceful and shrewd enough to win the trust of local indigenous leaders, he learned of something enormous lying to the south. In September of 1513, he led roughly 190 Spaniards and several hundred indigenous allies across the jungled spine of Panama. On September the 25th, a local guide told him the ocean was visible from the ridge ahead. Balboa climbed it alone. He looked south and became the first European to see the Pacific Ocean from the shores of the Americas. For days later, he waded into the water in full armor and formally claimed the entire Pacific Ocean and every land it touched for the crown of Castile. It was an audacious, almost absurd gesture. But it captured exactly the spirit of the age. What all of these men shared, Balboa, Cortés, Pizarro, dozens of lesser-known names, was not curiosity. They were not explorers in any modern sense. They were operators moving through unknown territory with one very clear objective: gold, land, labor, and the social rise that came with all three. Indigenous peoples, in their minds, were simultaneously an obstacle, a resource, and a workforce, a category that could shift depending entirely on the moment. And disease traveled with them in ways no one yet understood. Smallpox, measles, typhus, spreading through indigenous trade networks faster than any Spaniard could walk, sometimes arriving in a region months before a single European set foot there, leaving behind villages the conquistadors would later describe, with genuine confusion, as mysteriously empty. By 1519, 27 years after Columbus first made landfall, the Caribbean belonged entirely to Spain. And the governor of Cuba was preparing to send a new expedition toward a stretch of Mexican coastline, where sailors and shipwreck survivors had begun bringing back strange stories of a vast, organized civilization somewhere deep in the interior. He chose a man named Hernán Cortés to lead it. He would come to regret that decision almost immediately. Hernán Cortés was 33 years old when he sailed for Mexico, and he was already breaking the law before his ships even left the harbor. The governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, had appointed Cortés to lead the expedition, and then changed his mind. Reports had reached him that Cortés was too ambitious, too independent, too likely to serve his own interests over the governor's authority. Velázquez tried to cancel the mission. Cortés, who had already spent a fortune preparing it, simply left before anyone could stop him. In February of 1519, he sailed with 11 ships, roughly 550 men, 16 horses, and 14 cannons. From that moment on, he was operating entirely outside his own authority, a man who would have to answer directly to the Spanish crown, which meant he needed a victory dramatic enough to make his insubordination irrelevant. Failure, quite simply, was not an option he could afford. He landed on the Mexican coast in April of 1519 and immediately did something strange. He founded a town. He named it Villa Rica de la Veracruz, and had its new governing council formally appoint him as Captain General, answering directly to the king. It was a legal maneuver of impressive circularity, creating an authority from nothing so that authority could then appoint him. He sent a ship straight to King Charles I, also Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, carefully explaining everything he'd done, and why it was somehow entirely legal. Then, to stop his own men from sailing back to Cuba and reporting him, he scuttled his ships. Along the coast, Cortés made contact with the Totonac people, subjects of the Aztec Empire, and deeply resentful of the tribute they were forced to pay it. Through his interpreter, he began to understand exactly how fragile the empire he was walking toward truly was. That interpreter was a young Nahuatl-speaking woman named Malintzin, given to the Spanish as a slave after an earlier encounter on the coast. She spoke both Nahuatl and Maya, and became known to the Spanish as Dona Marina, and later to history as La Malinche. Her ability to speak directly with Aztec messengers, translate Moctezuma's own words, and read the political landscape of the interior was, by any honest account, as decisive to the conquest as any horse or cannon Cortés carried. Marching inland, Cortés met the Tlaxcalans, a fierce, independent people who had spent generations resisting Aztec domination. After several brutal days of fighting that the Spanish barely survived, the Tlaxcalans made a cold, calculated decision. These strangers were dangerous, but they were enemies of the Aztec, and an alliance was worth more than a war. By the time Cortés's column finally marched on the Aztec capital, his 500 Spaniards were walking alongside several thousand Tlaxcalan warriors. This is the detail most popular retellings quietly leave out, and it may be the most important one of all. The fall of the Aztec Empire was not, in any simple sense, a European victory over an indigenous civilization. It was, in large part, an indigenous uprising against an indigenous empire, in which the Spanish played a critical catalyzing role. Tenochtitlan itself, when the Spanish finally laid eyes on it in November of 1519, was unlike anything they had ever seen. Built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, connected to shore by broad causeways, it held somewhere between 200 and 300,000 people. Larger than any city in Spain. Larger than London. Larger than Paris. It had aqueducts. A market at Tlatelolco where tens of thousands traded daily. A ceremonial heart dominated by the Templo Mayor. A great twin pyramid where the Aztec performed the rituals that, in their understanding, held the entire universe together. It was an audacious, almost absurd gesture, but it captured exactly the spirit of the age. What all of these men shared, Balboa, Cortés, Pizarro, dozens of lesser-known names, was not curiosity. They were not explorers in any modern sense. They were operators moving through unknown territory with one very clear objective: gold, land, labor, and the social rise that came with all three. Indigenous peoples, in their minds, were simultaneously an obstacle, a resource, and a workforce, a category that could shift depending entirely on the moment. And disease traveled with them in ways no one yet understood. Smallpox, measles, typhus, spreading through indigenous trade networks faster than any Spaniard could walk, sometimes arriving in a region months before a single European set foot there, leaving behind villages the conquistadors would later describe, with genuine confusion, as mysteriously empty. By 1519, 27 years after Columbus first made landfall, the Caribbean belonged entirely to Spain. And the governor of Cuba was preparing to send a new expedition toward a stretch of Mexican coastline, where sailors and shipwreck survivors had begun bringing back strange stories of a vast, organized civilization somewhere deep in the interior. He chose a man named Hernán Cortés to lead it. He would come to regret that decision almost immediately. Hernán Cortés was 33 years old when he sailed for Mexico, and he was already breaking the law before his ships even left the harbor. The governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, had appointed Cortés to lead the expedition, and then changed his mind. Reports had reached him that Cortés was too ambitious, too independent, too likely to serve his own interests over the governor's authority. Velázquez tried to cancel the mission. Cortés, who had already spent a fortune preparing it, simply left before anyone could stop him. In February of 1519, he sailed with 11 ships, roughly 550 men, 16 horses, and 14 cannons. From that moment on, he was operating entirely outside his own authority, a man who would have to answer directly to the Spanish crown, which meant he needed a victory dramatic enough to make his insubordination irrelevant. Failure, quite simply, was not an option he could afford. He landed on the Mexican coast in April of 1519 and immediately did something strange. He founded a town. He named it Villa Rica de la Veracruz, and had its new governing council formally appoint him as Captain General, answering directly to the king. It was a legal maneuver of impressive circularity, creating an authority from nothing so that authority could then appoint him. He sent a ship straight to King Charles I, also Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, carefully explaining everything he'd done and why it was somehow entirely legal. Then, to stop his own men from sailing back to Cuba and reporting him, he scuttled his ships. Along the coast, Cortés made contact with the Totonac people, subjects of the Aztec Empire, and deeply resentful of the tribute they were forced to pay it. Through his interpreter, he began to understand exactly how fragile the empire he was walking toward truly was. That interpreter was a young Nahuatl-speaking woman named Malintzin, given to the Spanish as a slave after an earlier encounter on the coast. She spoke both Nahuatl and Maya, and became known to the Spanish as Dona Marina, and later to history as La Malinche. Her ability to speak directly with Aztec messengers, translate Moctezuma's own words, and read the political landscape of the interior was, by any honest account, as decisive to the conquest as any horse or cannon Cortés carried. Marching inland, Cortés met the Tlaxcalans, a fierce, independent people who had spent generations resisting Aztec domination. After several brutal days of fighting that the Spanish barely survived, the Tlaxcalans made a cold, calculated decision. These strangers were dangerous, but they were enemies of the Aztec, and an alliance was worth more than a war. By the time Cortés's column finally marched on the Aztec capital, his 500 Spaniards were walking alongside several thousand Tlaxcalan warriors. This is the detail most popular retellings quietly leave out, and it may be the most important one of all. The fall of the Aztec Empire was not, in any simple sense, a European victory over an indigenous civilization. It was, in large part, an indigenous uprising against an indigenous empire, in which the Spanish played a critical catalyzing role. Tenochtitlan itself, when the Spanish finally laid eyes on it in November of 1519, was unlike anything they had ever seen. Built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, connected to shore by broad causeways, it held somewhere between 200 and 300,000 people, larger than any city in Spain, larger than London, larger than Paris. It had aqueducts, a market at Tlatelolco where tens of thousands traded daily, a ceremonial heart dominated by the Templo Mayor, a great twin pyramid where the Aztec performed the rituals that, in their understanding, held the entire universe together. The Emperor Moctezuma II received Cortés with full ceremony, meeting him on the causeway with a procession of nobles and an exchange of gifts. Why he let the Spanish walk into the heart of his own capital has been debated for 500 years. He may have believed Cortés was a returning god. More likely, and this is what most historians believe today, he was making a cold political calculation. Bring them inside where he could watch them, study them, and decide later what to do. Within weeks, Cortés had taken Moctezuma hostage, inside a city of hundreds of thousands of people who were, at that moment, still not Spanish allies. An act of almost unthinkable audacity. The arrangement held, uneasily, for months. Then Cortés was forced to leave, to deal with a rival force sent to arrest him. He defeated them and convinced most of them to join him instead. While he was gone, his lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, made a catastrophic decision. During a major religious festival, he ordered an attack on the assembled Aztec nobility and priests, killing hundreds, possibly thousands. The city rose in fury. Moctezuma, brought out to calm his own people, was killed by his own people, by the Spanish, or by both. The truth was never settled. On the night of June 30th, 1520, a night the Spanish would call La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows, Cortés and his men tried to flee across the causeways in darkness, and were attacked from every side. The bridges had been pulled away. Men drowned in the lake, dragged under by the gold they refused to let go of. The Spanish lost perhaps half their number that night. But they were not finished. Cortés regrouped with the Tlaxcalans, built small boats to fight on the lake, and laid siege to Tenochtitlan for 3 brutal months. Smallpox, carried unknowingly by one of his own men, swept through the city at the same time, killing as efficiently as any weapon. The siege ended on August the 13th, 1521. The last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured trying to escape by canoe. He is said to have told Cortés that he had done everything a king could do to defend his city, and asked to be killed. Cortés did not kill him. Not then. Tenochtitlan lay in ruins. On its foundations, the Spanish began building a new city. They called it Mexico City. Francisco Pizarro could not read or write. He was the illegitimate son of a minor officer, raised without formal education, and had spent most of his adult life scrambling through failed ventures in the Caribbean without achieving anything. He was in his 50s, an old man by the standards of conquest, when he finally launched the expedition that would make him one of the most infamous figures in history. He had heard, from traders along the coast, stories of a vast and impossibly wealthy empire to the south. He had already tried twice to find it and failed both times. Before his third attempt, he did what Cortés had done before him. He went straight to the crown. In 1529, he brought llamas, fine textiles, and gold samples to the Spanish court, and returned with everything he needed: the right to conquer Peru, the title of governor, and full royal authorization. His third expedition was almost laughably small. 168 men, 62 horses, 1 cannon. By any reasonable military calculation, it was nowhere near enough to conquer an empire of 10 to 12 million people. But Pizarro had two advantages his small numbers didn't reveal: a continent already being ravaged by diseases that had arrived ahead of him, and an Inca Empire that had just finished tearing itself apart. The Inca state Tawantinsuyu, the Four Regions, was the largest empire the pre-Columbian Americas had ever produced, connected by roughly 25,000 miles of paved road across mountain and desert. But when the Emperor Huayna Capac died, almost certainly of smallpox, arriving ahead of any Spaniard, he left no clear heir. His two sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa, went to war over the throne. By the time Pizarro's men crossed into Inca territory in 1532, Atahualpa had won. But the war had left the empire exhausted, its people bitterly divided. Pizarro marched his tiny force up into the Andes, through terrain that should have made his advance impossible. Atahualpa, aware of the strangers, chose not to stop them. Perhaps he was curious. Perhaps he simply believed that his army of 80,000 men, camped near the town of Cajamarca, made 168 strangers a laughable threat. The meeting at Cajamarca, on November the 16th, 1532, remains one of the most disturbing events in the entire history of conquest. Pizarro invited Atahualpa into the central plaza. He arrived on a litter, surrounded by thousands of his own soldiers, dressed in extraordinary finery. Pizarro had hidden his cavalry and infantry around the edges of the square. A priest approached Atahualpa carrying a Bible and delivered a version of the Requerimiento. Atahualpa examined the book with interest and threw it to the ground. The priest called out that the terms had been rejected. Pizarro gave the signal. The cavalry charged from three sides. The cannon fired into the crowd. Steel met a mass of people armed only with slings and clubs, trapped with no room to move, and no idea what was happening. The slaughter lasted roughly 2 hours. Estimates place the dead somewhere between 2,000 and 7,000 people. Spanish casualties, approximately 0. Atahualpa was taken alive, and, understanding exactly what his life was worth to his captors, made an offer that has echoed through history ever since. He would fill the room he was held in with gold, as high as a man could reach. He would fill 2 more rooms with silver. In exchange, he wanted his freedom. The ransom arrived. Gold and silver poured in from across the empire. Sacred temple objects, ornaments, entire histories melted down into ingots. The total came to roughly 24 tons of precious metal, one of the largest single transfers of wealth in recorded history. Pizarro did not release him. He had Atahualpa tried on invented charges and sentenced to be burned alive, a death that, in Inca belief, would destroy any chance of an afterlife. A priest offered him an alternative: accept Christian baptism and be strangled instead. Atahualpa accepted. He was baptized and executed anyway. Pizarro marched on to Cusco, the Inca capital, and stripped it bare, including the great Temple of the Sun, its walls once lined entirely in sheets of gold. He installed a puppet emperor named Manco Inca, who would later lead one of the largest indigenous uprisings of the entire colonial era, before retreating into the mountains to found an independent Inca state that survived, hidden, for another 36 years. Pizarro's own end came from the same world he had built. His former partner, Diego de Almagro, turned against him after a failed expedition to Chile. Pizarro had him strangled. In 1541, a group of Almagro's men broke into Pizarro's palace and stabbed him to death at his own dining table. By then, the Inca Empire had already been dismantled. Its roads, its storehouses, its temples all absorbed, repurposed, or destroyed. What Spain had found in Peru was something even larger than the gold already taken. A mountain of silver was waiting. In April of 1545, according to the story told afterward, a Quechua herder named Diego Walpa lit a fire overnight on the slope of a great reddish mountain in the Bolivian highlands, and the fire melted something in the rock beneath it. A thin river of silver ran out across the ground. The mountain was called Sumac Orco in Quechua. The Spanish renamed it Cerro Rico, the Rich Mountain. It was, as mountains go, extraordinarily well named. Within a year, a mining camp had appeared at its base. Within a decade, that camp had become a city. By the 1600s, Potosí, sitting nearly 16,000 feet above sea level, so high the thin air made newcomers dizzy and sick for weeks, had a population of somewhere between 160 and 200,000 people. Larger than London, larger than Rome, larger than Madrid. One of the largest cities on earth, built entirely around a hole in a mountain, in one of the most punishing environments on the continent. The ore was rich enough, at first, to smelt directly using small indigenous wind furnaces that dotted the hillsides at night like a field of candles. But by the 1550s, the easy silver was gone. What remained required a new, far more dangerous process: mercury amalgamation, introduced by a refiner named Bartolomé de Medina in 1554. The mercury came from mines at Huancavelica, in Peru, worked under conditions just as brutal. Mercury poisoning moved through the workforce in a well-documented terrible progression: tremors, nerve damage, tooth loss, and eventually death. A man who spent years at Potosí or Huancavelica paid for that silver with his own body. The labor came from a system called the mita, an obligation that forced roughly 1/7 of the adult indigenous male population of a defined region to travel to Potosí each year, bring their own food and tools, and work shifts underground lasting up to a week at a time. Whole villages relocated just to escape its reach. The demographic toll was devastating. Some contemporary Spanish accounts spoke of 8 million dead over the mine's history, a number modern historians still debate, but one that reflects a chilling, shared understanding, even at the time, of exactly what that mountain was costing. A phrase entered common Spanish speech: "Vale un Potosí," worth a Potosí, meaning something of almost unimaginable value. The phrase never mentioned what a Potosí actually cost. Between roughly 1500 and 1800, historians estimate the Americas produced 85% of the entire world's silver, most of it from Potosí and the mines of Zacatecas in Mexico. It flooded into Europe in quantities the continent had never experienced, and triggered a slow, grinding wave of inflation that economists later called the price revolution. And in one of history's stranger ironies, Spain, sitting on more silver than any nation on earth, went bankrupt again and again and again, 6 times in roughly 90 years. The silver bought foreign goods instead of building Spanish industry. It paid foreign bankers instead of Spanish workers. It moved through Spanish hands and kept going. The mountain kept giving. Spain somehow always stayed broke. By the mid-1600s, colonial Spanish America had solidified into something layered, contradictory, and strange. A hierarchy of race and birth that touched every part of daily life. At the top sat the peninsulars, people born in Spain holding almost all real power. Below them, the criollos, full Spanish descent, but born in the Americas, wealthy, established, and quietly resentful of a system that gave outsiders authority over their own homeland. Below them, the mestizos of mixed Spanish and indigenous descent, caught in an unstable middle position. And forming the base of the entire structure, the indigenous population, paying tribute, performing the labor the whole system depended on. Enslaved Africans, brought across the Atlantic in growing numbers, formed yet another layer, alongside free black and mixed communities who occupied a strange, uncertain space defined more by what they were forbidden to do than by what they were. The Spanish gave this hierarchy an almost obsessive legal structure. The Sistema de Castas, dozens of increasingly elaborate racial categories, illustrated in paintings some wealthy families commissioned to display their own place within it. And yet, within this rigid system, something else was quietly happening. A genuine cultural fusion. Food, language, architecture, faith, blending in ways no one had planned and no one could fully control. Cathedrals rose on the ruins of indigenous temples. Universities opened in Mexico City and Lima in 1551, among the oldest in the entire Western Hemisphere. A Franciscan friar named Bernardino de Sahagun spent decades recording Aztec history and belief directly from indigenous informants, producing one of the most important surviving records of pre-conquest Mesoamerican life. A strange, quiet irony, given what his own church had helped destroy. And in a convent near Mexico City, a woman named Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, a brilliant poet and philosopher, found the only place in her entire society where a woman was permitted to think, write, and read freely. The empire was not simply an extraction machine, though extraction sat at its center. It was also, somehow, a civilization. For a brief, extraordinary window in the late 1500s and early 1600s, the Spanish Empire became the closest thing the world had yet seen to a truly global trade network. It began with a voyage in 1519, the same year Cortés landed in Mexico. Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese navigator sailing under a Spanish flag, led 5 ships west, crossed the Atlantic, threaded the dangerous passage at the tip of South America that still bears his name, and crossed the Pacific, nearly 4 months without sighting land. His crew reduced to eating rats and boiling leather to survive. Magellan reached the Philippines in March of 1521, and was killed there weeks later in a local conflict. A Basque navigator, Juan Sebastián Elcano, took command of the one surviving ship and completed the journey home. Of the 260 men who had set out, 18 returned. They had sailed around the entire world. But crossing the Pacific was only half the puzzle. For decades, ships could reach Asia, but couldn't reliably sail back. The solution came in 1565 from a navigator named Andrés de Urdaneta, who realized that sailing far north before turning east would catch a different set of winds entirely, ones that curved back toward the California coast. That single discovery made the Pacific a two-way road for the first time, and gave birth to the Manila Galleon trade, which ran, almost without interruption, for 250 years. Philip II died in 1598, leaving behind the largest empire in the world, and a treasury that was once again effectively empty. His son, Philip III, had none of his father's discipline. Where Philip II read every document personally, Philip III handed control of the entire government to a favored minister, the Duke of Lerma, who used the position mainly to enrich himself, before quietly arranging to be made a cardinal the moment corruption charges began to close in. Beneath all this political drift, a deeper problem was steadily compounding. Spain had become, in effect, a conduit. American silver flowed in, and immediately flowed straight back out again, paying for manufactured goods that Spain's own weakened industries could no longer compete with. Textiles, weapons, tools bought from France, England, and the increasingly wealthy Dutch Republic. The Dutch, in fact, were fighting a war of independence against Spain at the very moment they were building the most advanced economy in Europe, inventing the modern stock exchange, founding the Dutch East India Company, the first company in history to sell public shares. Spain's silver, in a strange twist, was quietly funding the rise of the very rivals working to tear its empire apart. In 1609, Philip III expelled the Moriscos, descendants of Spanish Muslims, suspected of secretly practicing Islam. Roughly 300,000 people, many of them skilled farmers and craftsmen, were forced out, leaving entire agricultural regions without the people who knew how to work them. Philip IV inherited all of this and then added the 30 Years' War. His minister, the Count Duke of Olivares, understood the crisis clearly and tried to force Spain's regions to share the growing cost of empire more equally. The attempt triggered exactly the crisis he feared. In 1640, both Portugal and Catalonia revolted. Portugal broke away permanently. Catalonia was eventually crushed, but only after enormous cost. By 1648, Spain was forced to formally recognize the independence of the Dutch Republic, the war it had spent 80 years failing to win. 11 years later, it ceded territory to France. The center of power in Europe was shifting. Spain was still enormous, still wealthy in theory, still the ruler of two continents. But the muscle behind the empire, the fiscal strength, the military dominance, the sheer institutional confidence, was quietly, steadily wearing thin. The man who ended Spain's Habsburg dynasty was not a conqueror. He was a king who simply could not produce an heir. His body worn down by 2 centuries of a family tree that had folded relentlessly in on itself. Charles II, known to his own subjects as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, was the product of generations of intermarriage so extreme that his parents were uncle and niece. He struggled to chew. He walked and spoke late. His doctors, having exhausted every medical explanation, eventually decided he was simply cursed, and brought in exorcists who fared no better than the physicians had. He died in 1700, without an heir, and the question of who would inherit his empire triggered a continent-wide war. His will named Philip of Anjou, grandson of the French king, a choice that horrified the rest of Europe and dragged the continent into the War of the Spanish Succession. The war ended in 1713 with a compromise. Philip kept the Spanish throne and its American colonies, becoming Philip V, first of Spain's Bourbon kings, but paid for it dearly, surrendering territory across Europe, including Gibraltar, to Britain. The most capable of the new Bourbon kings, Charles III, brought real reform when he took the throne in 1759, reorganizing the military, revising taxes, loosening trade restrictions, and, in 1767, expelling the Jesuits from every Spanish territory on earth. But the reforms carried a hidden cost. Centralizing power in the hands of Spanish-born officials sent from Madrid deeply angered the Criollo elite, families who had lived in the Americas for generations, and increasingly believed they were fully capable of governing themselves. Then came the American Revolution in 1775 and the French Revolution in 1789, both spreading quietly, dangerously, through the letters and conversations of educated colonial elites. The Bourbon reforms had tried to strengthen the empire's grip. Instead, they had handed the next generation exactly the list of grievances they would need to tear it apart. The roots were still holding, but the next decade would bring something they could not survive. The Spanish Empire did not fall in a single dramatic blow. It unraveled piece by piece, beginning with a decision made in France by a man who never intended to destroy it at all. In 1805, the combined Spanish and French fleets met the British Navy off Cape Trafalgar. Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed them in under 5 hours. Nelson died in the battle. Spain's ability to protect its own trade routes and even communicate with its own colonies was effectively finished in a single afternoon. The Spanish king, Charles IV, had long since handed control of his government to a favored minister. In March of 1808, a riot forced Charles to abdicate in favor of his son, Ferdinand VII. Napoleon, watching all of this with quiet, calculating patience, summoned both men to Bayonne in France, under the pretense of mediation. It was not mediation. Napoleon pressured Ferdinand into returning the crown to his father, who then simply handed it to Napoleon, who gave it to his own brother, Joseph. The Spanish people responded with an uprising in Madrid on May 2, 1808, crushed the next morning with executions so brutal they became the subject of 2 of the most haunting paintings ever made, by Francisco de Goya. The war that followed, the Peninsular War, lasted 6 years and gave the English language a new word for guerrilla resistance. Guerrilla itself, Spanish for little war. But the deeper consequence unfolded quietly, an ocean away. If the legitimate king of Spain was a prisoner, and a French usurper sat on his throne, what exactly did the American colonies still owe to Madrid? Throughout 1810, one colony after another answered that question for itself. Caracas, Buenos Aires, Bogota, Santiago, and in Mexico, a parish priest named Miguel Hidalgo rang his church bell and called his congregation to rise, sparking a vast, violent movement of the indigenous and mestizo poor that terrified colonial elites almost as much as it terrified Spain itself. Ferdinand VII was eventually restored to the throne and responded by trying to crush every independence movement by force. It worked here and there for a while, but Spain's own internal chaos, a military revolt in 1820, 3 years of domestic political collapse, left its American campaigns starved of the support they needed. Simón Bolívar secured Colombia in 1819. San Martín crossed the Andes and liberated Chile the year before. Mexico won its independence in 1821. And in 1824, the Battle of Ayacucho ended the last significant Spanish military presence in South America. An empire that had taken a century and a half to build had dissolved in 15 years. In 1898, 323 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan, Spain fought its final imperial war and lost it in 4 months. The Spanish-American War ended with the Battle of Manila Bay, where the American fleet destroyed the Spanish squadron in under 7 hours, without losing a single ship. By December of that year, Spain had surrendered Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam, and sold the Philippines outright for $20 million. In a single document, Spain gave up everything that remained of the empire Columbus had set in motion 406 years earlier. But by then, the real ending had already happened decades before, in the wave of independence that swept the Americas between 1810 and 1825. What that empire left behind was not an absence. It was something far more complicated. Spanish is spoken today by roughly 500 million people, the second most spoken native language on Earth, carrying, inside its very words, the memory of everything that happened. Catholicism remains the dominant faith across Latin America, fused, in ways no one planned, with older spiritual traditions that survived beneath and inside it. The Columbian exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, and disease between two worlds that had never touched before, remains, arguably, the single most consequential biological event since the last ice age. Potatoes, maize, and tomatoes reshaped Europe's diet and its population. Horses, introduced by the Spanish, spread north through indigenous trade networks and quietly transformed entire cultures of the American plains that Spain itself never controlled. And the demographic cost beneath all of it remains almost impossible to fully comprehend. Conservative estimates suggest the indigenous population of the Americas fell by 50 to 90% within a century and a half of first contact. From a pre-contact population, scholars estimate at 50 to 100 million people. The empire built cathedrals and destroyed civilizations. It created a legal tradition that argued seriously for the humanity of the people it was simultaneously exploiting. It spread a language that would one day carry the words of Cervantes and Neruda and Garcia Marquez, while doing everything in its power to erase the languages that came before it. All of these things happened at the same time, in the same empire. None of them cancel the others out. And so, quietly, the story of the Spanish Empire comes to rest. A kingdom forged from centuries of conflict, carried across oceans on the ambition of a few hundred sailors and soldiers, stretched until it touched almost every shore on Earth, and then, slowly, inevitably, returned to something smaller. The Silver Mountains are still standing. The cathedrals are still there. The language, the food, the music, none of it has disappeared. History never really vanishes. It just becomes the ground beneath our feet. If you're still awake, there's another story waiting for you, just a little further into the dark. And if this one stayed with you tonight, feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a thought in the comments below. It genuinely means something. For now, though, let your shoulders drop. Let the story settle. Close your eyes. The empire has sailed its last voyage for tonight. Good night.